There have been many words written about the terrorism that altered the New York City skyline. You grieve for the city whose once indelible profile was mutilated, just like that, on one beautiful September morning. The words of New York Times columnist Frank Rich, who joins us from our New York bureau. As does David Remnick, editor of the New Yorker magazine, who writes in a cover story about the snowball of murderous debris, the shards of glass and the glittering steel panels speeding down from the sky. Now there was unbridled panic. David, the cover of the New Yorker this week is very stark, shades of black. Has that kind of cover ever appeared before in the existence of your magazine?
Absolutely not. Usually the idea of a New Yorker cover is either a very tenuous connection to the events or even more often a kind of joyful city scene or a celebration of some scene or another. But there's no joy to find in this. There was no way to even begin to apply one's imagination to what happened here, and it seemed a kind of egoless image, black on black, the shadow almost of the missing World Trade Center. It was the only image that seemed adequate to what was going on. At Pearl Harbor, it was quite a different story, and maybe it was because we lived in an almost medialess world, a world of radio. Pearl Harbor was very far away, and it took a long time for that to really absorb into the guts of the American people. Certainly for New Yorkers and Washingtonians, this was so immediate and unmediated by the media. You could look out your window and see hell.
Frank Rich, we heard earlier in John Donovan's report about the newspaper front pages a week ago and the television programs and the stories about Barry Bonds and Michael Jordan and Gary Condit. Suddenly now, a week later, it seems as if the trivial is trivial again.
Yeah, the trivial is trivial again, and it's interesting because it seems to me we've come out of a period of a number of years now where we've taken trivial stories that have an element of crisis to them, sometimes legitimately so. Elian Gonzalez, shark attacks, school shootings, and elevated them in our lives to the point where they seem like the fall of Western civilization. And now, a week later, we're in a situation where Western civilization is really being challenged, and it kind of puts all those stories, even the big ones, let alone the trivial sports or entertainment stories, into perspective.
David, every once in a while there are those moments in history in which one senses an intrinsic change. Perhaps for our generation it was the assassination of JFK and Vietnam. Perhaps for another generation it was World War II. Is this one of those genuine moments?
Yes, and I think, at least to my mind, it's far even more profound than the assassination of JFK, which was tragic and something we feel and discuss to this day. But look at what's happened. It is something that has shattered our sense of protectiveness, our fortress America, as it's called. The very fragility of life on Manhattan Island has been shattered. Our sense of the arrangement of the world. I was one who covered the collapse of the Soviet Union and the end of the Cold War, and there was much talk about the end of history. And now we find ourselves in a world that's far more complicated than even the depths of the Cold War. I think you're going to be finding that, for example, an essay like Samuel Huntington's The Clash of Civilization, which posits the idea that civilizations like the West, broadly defined, and the Islamic world, broadly defined, are an inherent clash. These kinds of discussions are going to crowd out the trivial. And the trivial, by the way, was always trivial, and it was the fault largely of the media for raising them up to the level of so-called narratives, of national narratives. And they distorted our political dialogue in a horrendous way. But all that aside, we have to be equal to an extremely serious moment and a prolonged moment of serious discussion and debate and examination. It is not merely the job of the government, but also the press and of citizens.
David Remnick, we want to take you up on that point and bring Frank Rich back in. We have to take a break just now. We'll be back with our guests in just a moment. We're back again with Frank Rich from the New York Times and David Remnick, editor of the New Yorker magazine. Frank, you wrote in your column in the New York Times on Saturday that an entire culture has been transformed by this event. That's a very sweeping statement. You want to explain it?
Yeah, I feel that we've gone through this period where we've been incredibly fat and happy. We believed that we could have it all, even though the market had started to decline and unemployment was up before this calamity. The fact is that still a few weeks ago our politicians were telling us we could have a tax cut, we could have better schools, better defense, we wouldn't spend the Social Security Trust Fund. There's been an air of unreality, and I feel our culture, even our pop culture, has reflected this simultaneously. This whole fetishization of World War II, for instance, while The Greatest Generation was indeed a great thing, it sort of went off the rails in the past year or so with movies like Pearl Harbor, for instance, which cosmeticized what war was, what even that battle was, with just a sense that we have a kind of, as the writer John Gregory Dunn said, a virtual patriotism instead of a real patriotism. And when you saw those firefighters and New York policemen, these really brave men, the way that they behaved in this crisis and sacrificed their lives, I think it was a jolt to our culture. It's no longer a bunch of World War II movies. It's no longer reality television shows with names like Fear Factor and Lost and Survivor. We now know what fear is again, or I hope we do.
I think it's incredible, these firefighters who were like medieval knights, to watch them in that even to this day, very peculiar headgear in their robes, and going into flaming skyscrapers when people are streaming out. If their loss can be turned into anything, it can be an example of all kinds of courage and clear-sightedness that all of us need, whether it's the clear-sightedness of debate or of honest political action and of firmness, and never losing sight of the seriousness of the moment. I think in the weeks to come, the New Yorker, for example, in a very tiny thing, didn't have cartoons. It's the first time this has happened since the publication of John Hersey's Hiroshima. I just couldn't see publishing cartoons about talking dogs or psychiatrist jokes or the rest. But we're going to need real life and ordinary life and family life, and not allow this to overwhelm us utterly, but at the same time to have a certain seriousness of discussion, which has been largely missing from American public life for quite a long time during these fat, happy years.
The other consequence, perhaps, and we heard a bit of it in John Donvan's report, and Frank, I'd like you to pick up on this. We heard from a Washington journalist who said perhaps the era of cynicism is going to end. Do you think that, for one thing, every motive of every politician will be questioned now the way it was last week?
Well, perhaps not as much, and I'm against cynicism as anyone else is, but I do think the journalists and the media in general cannot now abandon skepticism. If this country is entering a war, there are a lot of very complicated decisions that have to be made. They're very complex, not only to politicians, but to citizens who are dealing with enemies they don't quite understand in places they don't quite know where they are, and there are ethical decisions to be made, legal decisions to be made, political decisions. We have to examine them closely. I would hope that the kind of cynicism we would lose would be, worrying about these politicians' sex lives all the time, or worrying about things that simply don't matter. Take for instance, the mayor of New York, who's been such a towering figure to this city over the past week. No one gives a damn anymore about his marital problems, and we shouldn't have turned it into a huge drama even before this point. We have to be tough about the things that really matter, and forget about the circuses.
I mean, remember, we are in a situation where the enemy itself is vague. It's certainly in the larger manifestation of it. If Osama bin Laden is at the center of this, so be it. But this is not a situation like 1941, where Japan had attacked in its supposed self-interest, and we knew where to return fire, a national conflict. We have an enormously complex task ahead of us. And people who just want to charge in willy-nilly anywhere and at everything out of pure rage, what's next? Going to war against the entire Islamic world. These things require real intelligence and real moral and political leadership, and dispensing with triviality.
Frank Rich, we have Frank, we have just less than 30 seconds left. As we go into this new period, our leaders are preparing us for a long, bloody conflict. What is the measure of success?
What is the measure of success? I think the measure of success is uniting the country, but around a goal that makes sense, much as David was just saying, that isn't jingoistic, that deals with the full complexity of the situation. Of course, we want to whip terrorism, but we have to do it in the right way, in an effective way, not go off half-cocked, and the country has to be brought along by its political leaders in a responsible way, be told what's going on, why we're doing what we're doing, and have sunlight to a great extent into the process, if not into all the details, obviously, of what we're going to do.
Frank Rich, on that note, thank you so much for joining us. David Remnick, both in New York, we appreciate it.